All right, Dylan, thanks for that handoff. I also want to thank you all for attending today. I can only imagine how busy everyone is. So real quick, like Dylan was talking about, I wanted to go over a quick little overview of what to expect in this webinar. We're going to talk about ESSA data and how Agile breaks that up between school and student performance. We'll also talk about a new Agile trending data metric we've created and ESSA 3 funding. So the first part of this topic, ESSA data, I want to make sure we're on the same page because it's been called a lot of different things over the years. Where it really started was with No Child Left Behind, AYP. It was the first attempt at quantifying district and school performance that, in turn, impacted the established funding of ESSA. Now, the No Child Left Behind, or the AYP approach, it was an all or nothing approach, and a lot of states had issues with it. If one subgroup failed, then everybody fell for English. Now, it was a federal setup, and that was really handy, but the states were having a hard time having 51 different states all use the same sort of metric. And because of that, it's evolved into ESSA data. Now, what is ESSA data? Let's take a look. So ESSA data has been in place for a while now. It's actually gone through 2 different presidents, and it still deals with the allocating of federal funds, ESSA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act. States like it better, and here's why. It allows states to tackle their own education aspects. What that means is instead of having an all or nothing approach, they can set up however they want. They can make sure that they're bringing in different metrics to decide if a school is successful or if a district's successful. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of federal requirements associated with this. And the way Agile likes to look at this is there's kind of 2 different ways to look at ESSA requirements that the states report. The first is school performance. And what that is generally, it's a single metric that encompasses the entire school and how it's doing. You know, a lot of different data points can go into that metric, i.e. attendance, how students and teachers feel, even parents, proficiencies at different grade levels and different subjects, grad rates, SAT scores, test participation. Every single state gets to decide their own academic scale for school performance. And that's really, really handy because, again, the states have that freedom now with ESSA. The other part that Agile really likes to focus on is student performance. And this is where ESSA has a lot of requirements. They require that English, language arts, and math get tested every year, 3rd through 8th grade. There's also testing requirements on science, once in high school, and generally in 5th and 8th grade as well. Now, states can add on to that also. They can do things like social studies and writing, but please keep in mind, this is a really, really high level because ESSA goes into a lot of details on which subgroups need to be reported on and which demographics need to be reported on. So we're taking a really, really high look at this to make sure there's a broad understanding. So, you know, there's pros and cons to this approach. With No Child Left Behind, it was one data source, super easy to collect and report to our clients. Now, there's 51 different ways to collect the data and report the data. It's made it a little trickier. Great for the states, trickier for data collection. So what did we do to make sure we could get that data? Well, we had to look at the data and information available out there. And where it really starts was with data collection. We had to reach out to every single state and DC and comb through their different web pages. What that did is that created multiple files we had to source to make sure we could get that data. Sometimes as many as 30, 35 files for a single state. Then within those files, depending on the state, there could be quite literally thousands of data points to comb through. And that's when you could find the information. Sometimes you can even find the information. You knew there was supposed to be 3rd through 8th testing for English language arts, but you couldn't find it. So we made sure we reached out at the state DOE levels and ensured we were collecting and reporting everything available. Now, there was a silver lining to that. Because we've been doing it so long, we've actually developed some really good relationships at the state level. And where this helps out is when we see numbers that don't quite seem to add up, or when we think there's missing data. And sometimes there's certainly a reason for it, but getting that confirmation at the state level make sure that we're collecting all the data we need to so that we can normalize it. So when we normalize it, although there's 51 different ways to report it, like we were saying, ESSA does have the requirements in place, and we had to look for those similarities. And where were those similarities? Again, the way Agile looks at it, we can kind of break it up into two areas. There's a school performance, and that's that academic indicator, academic scale, if you will. And then there's student performance. And where that really shows itself is grade level and cumulative level subject proficiencies, i.e. English, language arts, math, science, sometimes social studies, rarely writing. So I know we went over a lot of information. Let's actually take a look at a couple of examples of that academic indicator, that school performance as we call it here at Agile. So what you see is 3 different states here. And again, with every state having that flexibility to use what kind of scale they want to use to determine which schools are really, really solid and which ones need help, every state gets to do it their own way. In Georgia, you can see that they use the College and Career Ready Performance Index, the CCRPI. It's really simple. It's a scale from 100 down to 1. Here in Colorado, we use the school performance framework. The highest is performance, then you get down to improvement, then priority, and then turnaround. Next, Texas and Florida and a couple other states, they kept it really simple, and they used a simple A through F, just like a report card, ranking for their schools. You can see it's really, really handy if you know the market you're looking at. If you live in Colorado or you're working with Colorado schools, you know that performance is the highest. You know that turnaround is the lowest. That's great. But where this is tricky is how do you compare schools from Georgia to Colorado to Texas? And if you look down at the bottom, you can see the Agile adjusted points. And what that did is we tried to normalize that data across all the states so that if you want to group multiple schools across states, you can do that with our adjusted points. For Colorado, performance would be the highest. It would be 100 points because our adjusted points are on a scale from 100 down to 0. Excuse me. The lowest would be turnaround. So it's scale like this. Performance would be 100 points, improvement would be 66, priority would be 33, and turnaround would be 0. And what that did is, again, normalized it across the entire US. And what we found is about 40 points is right about where that pass-fail line is for schools. And again, having it all in one place is really, really handy so that you can look at like schools and see what they're dealing with. Now, I know we went over a lot of information here. Let's actually start looking at a story, okay? And we're going to start looking at a couple specific schools. What we did is we took 2 similar schools. On the surface, looked really, really similar. So the shallow knowledge, data you can easily obtain, they look the same. We're going to show you how they're not the same by using ESSA Data. And again, the way Agile breaks up ESSA Data is really kind of into 2 categories. The school performance, like that academic indicator that we just went over for the 3 different states. And that's a comprehensive how is the school doing within that state. And student performance, and that's grade level proficiencies and cumulative level proficiencies. The percentage of students in the respective grade or school that are proficient in that subject. So let's dig in a little bit. What we did is we took Obadiah Knight and Cedarcrest. They're both in Dallas ISD, the independent school district. On the surface, you look at them, they'd both be categorized as urban schools. They're both grade levels, PK through 5. They're both Title I schools and high Title I schools at that. The enrollment is almost identical, 385 to 350. And even the student-teacher ratio looks like it's about the same. They're relatively close to each other, about 10 miles apart. But if you're to look at that and craft your message, you'd be missing the point because these schools are very, very different. So let's look at the student performance. And again, that's those proficiency scores, the percentage of students proficient in a specific subject. For these 2 schools, Cedarcrest Falcons and Obadiah Knights, you're going to see English language arts scores, you're going to see math scores, and you're going to see science scores. And by scores, I mean proficiency. In other states, you'll also see social studies and writing, but for this example, we're really going to focus on English language arts, math, and science. And you're going to see it presented two different ways. You're going to see it at the grade level, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, because that's an ESSA requirement. And you're also going to see it represented at a cumulative level, how the school is doing overall. The next one, we're also going to present the new Agile metric we've created. We're really excited about this one. It shows some trending data. We'll touch on that later because I want to make sure everybody understands how that ESSA data is reported at the student performance level. So let's jump in. In 2019, you can see Cedarcrest Falcons had an academic indicator, so how the school's doing overall, as an F. That's the lowest score in all of Texas. So their adjusted points were at 0. If you look at their cumulative proficiency scores, Cedarcrest was at 11% for ELA, 16 for math, and 9 for science. On the flip side, Obadiah Knights were doing quite well. They had a B for their academic indicator, the adjusted points of 75, and their proficiency scores were all hovering right around 50%. Now, what's also important to remember is because Cedarcrest Falcons were so low, they were also flagged as a targeted support and improvement school. And Dallas even has a categorization for that called an ACE campus. They were struggling. 2020 came along, and most states test kids in their subjects in March of 2020. A lot of stuff going on last March of 2020, so nobody tested the kids. They all applied for an ESA waiver, and the federal government approved it across the US. Kids weren't tested last March. Now, let's look at 2021. You can see for 2021, it's almost flipped. Real quickly, looking at that academic indicator, Texas hasn't reported those yet. And there's a really good reason why. All those different data points they need to use, well, they weren't able to get all of those. So they just simply didn't report the academic indicator this year. However, they certainly tested for ELA, math, and science. And if you look at the scores, Cedarcrest has done a great job. They've shot up nearly 20% in ELA, almost 30% in math, and increased in science. Now, Obadiah Knights, on the other side of the coin, they've dropped. And in ELA, quite significantly, nearly 30%. They've dropped in math as well, and they stayed pretty much the same in science. So this is kind of painting a high level. Let's go down even a little lower now. Because ESSA data will also show you grade level proficiencies. And I know there's a lot of info on this slide, but the important points are, look at 3rd and 4th grade for Cedarcrest back in 2019. They were at about 6% proficiency. 6% of their 3rd graders were at grade level for 3rd grade ELA proficiency. About 6% for 4th graders. 5th grade, they were around 20%. And it gave that cumulative of around 11% that we saw on the previous slide. Looking at math, higher, but still not where it should be. As opposed to 2021, 3rd graders were significantly up from 6% to 34%. That's great. You know, similar gains in 4th grade, and you see the gains in math and science as well. Obadiah Knights, well, they dropped. And unfortunately, that's kind of the norm with the data we've been able to collect so far. Now, Obadiah Knights dropped significantly in 3rd and 4th grade proficiencies. They were at 43 and 46% respectively. They dropped to 6 and 10. Now, quick little look, wow, that's a huge drop, and it is. Well, let's look at some of the contributing factors here. First off, for the kids, the last real school year uninterrupted, if you were in 3rd grade now, your last normal school year was 1st grade. There's a big reason why you see those drops for 3rd and 4th graders at Obadiah. They weren't ready to take those tests because they hadn't experienced what we would consider a normal school year. But Cedarcrest does show some interesting data, and we're going to find out why it's interesting when we start talking about the story. But for right now, we've dug in really, really deep. We've seen some grade level proficiencies. We've seen some cumulative proficiencies in the academic indicators. And if you really want to dive in, that data is available. Agile presents it, ESSA requires it, and you can gain access to it. If that's a little too deep of a dive for you, well, this is where our new trending learning recovery process comes into play. Now, what we did is we kept it really, really simple. We showed where they are going with cumulative ELA trending, math trending, and science trending. And again, at a really high level, super simple to see. Cedarcrest Elementary, they've experienced learning gains in English and in math. Science, they're neutral. Now, for those of you that are remembering all the details, well, technically they jumped from 9 to 11. Looking at the multiple years of past data, you normally saw a variance of about 5%, give or take. So when we were creating this metric, if it was within plus minus 5%, we decided, you know what, that's neutral. That's kind of expected year over year. What's not expected is what you saw at Obadiah Nights, where they experienced significant learning loss in ELA and math, at least in normal school years. And what this does is this takes really broad strokes and says, these people are going up, these people are going down. They have experienced learning loss. There's an opportunity for learning recovery. Okay. Now, why this is so important, these learning gains and learning loss, is because learning loss really ties into ESSA funding. And we'll touch on that a little later, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page with the story and what the data really shows. So the best thing to do here is by looking at this data, you can relate to their story. Cedarcrest is a success story. It's the exception to what we've been seeing across the US. And quite honestly, I saw all the data, but I wanted to hear the story. So I actually called them and I talked to him. The office manager, she was super polite. And I said, you know, looking at some of these metrics across Texas and even in Dallas within specific schools, you're one of the success stories. What happened? And, you know, she pointed out things that our data shows. She talks about them, well, they were one of the lowest schools within Dallas and within Texas. And what that created is, one, in the last 2 years, they had a 75% churn in staff. And they also got a new principal. Well, that churn in staff and that new leadership, it motivated and re-energized a dedicated staff. Another really important part is they got appropriate funding to invest in what many would consider a failing school at the time. And what they did is in 2019, they said, all right, here's our plan, we're going to set it, and we're going with it. They were prepared, no matter quite literally what was thrown at them, that they were going to create the culture and they were going to excel regardless of outside influences. And again, it was so nice talking to the office manager because she was just beaming. You could hear it over the phone. She was excited. She was proud of what they've accomplished, and she absolutely should be. She gave all the credit to her staff and her students, and she just kept on saying they created the right culture that they were going to succeed. Now, Obadiah, unfortunately, with COVID, that's pretty much the norm. We're seeing significant learning loss across the nation for the states we've already collected. Now, another story I want to bring up real quick is when we looked at ESSA Data years ago and we looked into Colorado. Colorado, we reached out in Denver to schools, quite similar. We said we want to find one in Denver that's failing and one that is succeeding. And we found one that was on the lowest rating for Colorado turnaround. And we called the principal and we talked to him. And we said, you know, what keeps you up at night? What makes things difficult for you to do your job, you know, which is making sure the children are in a good spot. He said, honestly, Mike, our concerns, one, I have to calm staff down weekly that they're going to have a job next year. We have to take a step back and make sure we're prioritizing the children's education and not worrying about all these outside factors. The kids, they have to deal with homelessness, hunger, on a lesser scale, Wi-Fi accessibility. They can't deal with everything that's going on, and they had to make sure that any sort of improvements they had were quick and they were impactful. So what they were doing is they were heavily researching different approaches to teaching the curriculum to ensure they could see a quick turnaround on proficiency numbers. For the school that was doing really well in Colorado, and I have to chuckle a little bit, as a coach, you get this a lot. Her number one issue with her school, with what would help her out, was dealing with overbearing parents. The parents were so involved that they were pinging the teachers and the principal so much that it was actually a detriment to trying to teach the children. They simply needed some sort of software that allowed the parents to check all the information they're asking the teachers electronically online. And again, knowing what you're dealing with, whether it's Colorado a couple years ago or even Texas now, knowing the data that's related to the schools, that helps you message accordingly. So what we did there is we kind of showed you, dug into Dallas, showed a couple schools, showed what they experienced. Now I want to kind of go back up, and I want to start talking about Texas in general. So at the state level, 2/3 of their schools and districts are lower than they were in 2019 for English language arts proficiency. 3/4 are lower in math proficiency. With those numbers right there, if you're creating a blanket message to reach out to these people, you're missing the mark on schools like Cedarcrest. They worked really hard to get where they are. Don't lump Cedarcrest in with the other schools. You know, if you do that, it borders on disrespectful to all the work they put into achieving what they did. The wrong message, it downplays everything that the staff and the kids committed to and executed on. And you don't want to start the conversation off that way. ESSA data shows this. Now, what's this mean for the entire US? Let's go back up and we'll look at the US now. Simply put, we don't have all the data yet. The data hasn't been released. There's a bunch of reasons why. Colorado, well, they just switched their alternating years for when they would test ELA and math. And that was approved with an ESEA waiver. So now for this, previously it was 3rd, 5th, and 7th grade would take one subject, 4th, 6th, and 8th would take another subject. Unfortunately for my son, that was decided a week after he took both tests. He wasn't psyched with that one, but it's the way it is sometimes. Illinois, they actually have a retaking option right now. And what it means is if kids are currently in 4th grade, they can take the 3rd grade test as a way to kind of catch up and make sure their numbers are more reflective of where they currently are. So they can't get that data out until all those tests come in, they run the numbers, and then they're able to get that out. With any luck, we'll start seeing more states coming in mid to late November. Now, the states we have been able to collect, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Minnesota, we're seeing significant loss, okay? Nearly 90% of the institutions within those 4 states are lower for their ELA cumulative proficiencies. Math is even higher than that. Science is right around 90% as well. But this isn't a message about doom and gloom, okay? We picked Cedarcrest out for a reason. Look at what worked there. They had the right staff. They had a plan in place. They had kids that were ready to learn, and they had the funding to tackle it. And that's really important. They had the resources to find success. And this is what ties us in to our ESSA funding, ESSA 3 funding in particular. Now, ESSA funding, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, we're looking at the 3rd funding, and that was released in March of 2021, okay? There was a lot of money associated with this ESSA 3 funding. There's $800 million for services to students experiencing homelessness. There was $7 billion for E-Rate, which is an FCC program focusing on telecommunications and information services. There's $39 billion for early childhood education. And here's the big one, $180 billion for education. Now, how did that $180 billion break out for education? Let's take a look. with ESSA 3 funding, you can see that $40 billion went to higher education. You can also see that special education was around $3 billion and non-public was a little under $3 billion. The bulk of this funding went to the K-12 public school universe. $123 billion has been allocated to K-12 schools, public K-12 schools, excuse me. So what are they allowed to do? How that money break down? Again, let's dig a little deeper now. For the funding breakdown, the distribution of funds, it's primarily based on Title I. So 90% of the funds to the ELAs are based on Title I, Part A grant. Okay, how it can be spent? First off, these funds need to be spent by September of 2024. They can't sit on the money. And 20% of it needs to be used for addressing learning loss or learning recovery. So I like a good story. Let's go back to Dallas real quick. Dallas received over $500 million in their ESSA 3 funding. That means over $100 million has to be used to tackle learning recovery or learning loss. Okay. Side note, Agile, we have all these data points too. We have estimates for the amount used for learning loss and the overall ESSA 3 fundings. We also have 2 and 1, but one's already been spent. With that in mind, this breaks out to thousands of dollars per student in Dallas. And like I said, at least $100 million has to be used to address those metrics that we pointed out, those learning loss schools, the schools that have experienced learning loss. Taking it to a different area, Westminster, a small little town northwest here of Denver, they received $20 million in funding. Now, I said that 20% is the minimum. And that's what Westminster has done. They treated it as a minimum. They have already allocated $16 million to address learning loss. And they've done a couple interesting things, but one that I thought warranted a mention is they're already working with the Boys and Girls Club to help address that social and emotional aspect of education loss. But again, they're not 20%, they're much, much, much higher. So what can these funds be used for? There's a lot of freedom in there, okay? Some are tackling it with summer school, after school programs, tutoring, teacher recruitment and retention, because we're seeing a lot of churn there, okay? And we've seen even examples of districts submitting new stadium proposals because the argument is that will bring students together and again tackle that social and emotional aspect. So what it means, there's a lot of freedom in these, okay? You can get furniture. If it helps the students and helps the teachers, this money can be used there. And what this really means is looking at ESSA data, looking at, ESSA data, tying this all together, looking at the learning loss and opportunity, and by identifying the right schools, you'll know if they have ESSA funding, if they have ESSA funding, and it helps you craft the right message so that you can engage in a meaningful and important connection with your prospective clients.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming and your participation. And thank you, Mike, for a great presentation.